Before we begin, find a quiet place to rest. Let the weight of the day fall away and let your breathing settle into a gentle rhythm. Tonight, I will take you far from the present, across the centuries, to a place where rivers shaped the lives of those who lived beside them, and where the night sky told stories only the patient could hear. In this world, every stone holds a memory and every star a secret. If you listen closely, you may find that their voices still speak, even now. The desert air in the early dawn held a coolness that would vanish within hours, replaced by the slow, heavy warmth of the day. In this stillness, the world seemed to hold its breath. The sand outside the low mud brick walls of the settlement stretched in muted golds and silvers under a sky pale with the first tints of morning. Somewhere far off, a bird called once and then fell silent again. You imagine yourself walking barefoot over the cool ground, feeling the fine grains sift between your toes. There is a faint scent of wood smoke from the night's last embers, and the low, measured beat of a drum, perhaps from a shepherd keeping rhythm as he wakes his small flock. The air is soft and the world is simple here. It is the year 2600 before the Common Era, and the place you stand is not yet called by the name history will give it. To the people here, it is simply the home, a cluster of dwellings gathered close along the slow, winding bank of a river. This river is not mighty, not one of the grand waterways sung of by poets. It is quiet, dependable, its surface often glassy except where reeds shiver in the breeze. Men and women stir in the dim light. A woman in a linen wrap steps from her doorway, a clay jug balanced on her hip. She moves to the well at the center of the settlement, its rope and bucket worn smooth by countless hands. A child follows, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his hair sticking in soft directions. A dog yawns in the shadow of a wall, tail sweeping the ground lazily. The settlement has no walls yet, no gates to close at night. Trust still lingers here, the kind of trust that can only exist in a place so far from the quarrels of larger cities. But changes are coming. Slowly at first, like the subtle lengthening of days after the solstice, but changes nonetheless. Somewhere within a low structure roofed in reeds, a man sits cross-legged on a woven mat. Before him is a flat slab of clay, still damp. His hands are steady, his movements precise. Using a reed stylus, he makes tiny impressions in the surface. A list of goods, a record of trade. 2 jars of oil, 3 sacks of grain, a measure of copper. These marks will outlast him, pressed into clay that, when dried by the sun, will preserve the transaction for years. He cannot know that thousands of years later, people will study these symbols and hear the echo of his life in their shape. The river outside glints in the growing light. Beyond its banks, the land rises gently to hills where hardy shrubs cling to the rocky soil. Somewhere in those hills, stones are being cut for a new structure, something larger than any yet seen here. A gathering place the elders had decided, a place where the people can meet to speak of planting, of water, of matters that belong to all. The stones are heavy, the work slow, but no one complains. Life moves gently, marked by the seasons, the cycles of planting and harvest, the phases of the moon. Tonight, the moon will be just a sliver, low on the horizon when darkness falls, and the elders will meet in the open, sitting in a wide circle with the scent of oil lamps drifting in the air. The children of this place know little of the wider world. They have never seen the great cities upriver, never walked beneath walls so high they seem to scrape the sky. They have not heard the sound of hundreds of voices chanting together in the courtyards of temples. For them, the world begins at the bend of the river to the east and ends where the hills fade into the heat-shimmering horizon. And yet, on the edges of their awareness, stories drift in like seeds on the wind. A trader will arrive with strange shells from a distant shore, or a pot painted in colors they do not know. A traveler will speak of a city where the streets are paved with stone, where light burns in the night from lamps that never go out. This is how the threads begin to weave themselves, small, almost invisible strands that, over time, will form the fabric of history. The boy at the well, the woman with her jug, the man pressing symbols into clay, they are part of something they cannot yet name. As the sun lifts higher, the settlement wakes fully. The smell of baking bread mingles with the warm scent of the earth. A young man leads 2 donkeys to the river to drink, their hooves leaving soft impressions in the damp bank. Across the water, a fisherman mends his net, his fingers deft despite years of use. The surface of the river stirs briefly as a fish breaks it, the ripples moving outward until they fade. Overhead, a hawk circles once and then glides away toward the hills. Its shadow passes over the clay slab where the man continues his careful work, over the bread baking in the small ovens, over the heads of children chasing each other in the dust. It passes quickly, unnoticed by most, yet still marking a moment in this day, a day that will be remembered in some form by the records in clay and by the memories carried forward in the stories told here. Far away, beyond the hills, a group of strangers moves slowly toward the settlement. They carry packs heavy with goods, their faces shaded by wide brims of woven reeds. They do not yet know they will find rest here, that they will share their news of other lands, that their arrival will mark a small but lasting change in this place. For now, the sun rises, the river flows, and the quiet life of the settlement continues as it has for generations, with the gentle certainty of water finding its way to the sea. By mid-morning, the air has warmed enough that a thin shimmer rises above the river, bending the reflection of reeds and sky into slow, wavering bands. Work continues at an unhurried pace. The baker pulls rounds of bread from the clay oven with a flat paddle, sets them to cool on woven mats, and dusts his hands with a soft clap that sends a pale cloud drifting in the light. Children carry baskets of dates from a shady storage nook to a low table in the central space. A potter lifts a vessel from a coil of damp clay and smooths its lip with a wet thumb, leaving a perfect line that catches the silver edge of sun. Before midday, the strangers reach the bend of the river and pause beneath a stand of tamarisk. They drink, rinse dust from their faces, and loosen the straps of their loads, which lean and creak like tired animals settling their weight. They speak in a dialect the elders recognize, though some words are unfamiliar, like pebbles from a distant shore that do not quite fit the hand. One of the travelers steps forward with deliberate calm and offers a small sealed jar to the nearest villager. Inside is a scent like cool earth after rain, and a faint bitterness that suggests uses the villagers do not yet know. The elders call for a gathering as the sun inches past its highest point. People arrive and settle in a wide ring. The reed mats crackle softly, eyes adjust to the shared shade. The newcomers set their packs in a neat row and unroll a strip of leather covered in careful marks. A map of a sort. Not the entire world, only the world as a trader might carry it. Lines that follow rivers, dots that stand for crossing places, tiny wedges that mark hills where copper can sometimes be pried loose with effort and luck. The elders listen. The youngest of them, a woman with a low, steady voice, asks about news from upriver. The travelers tell of a larger settlement that has begun to make walls from clay and stone, not to keep out neighbors, they say, but to keep out the river when it swells. The oldest elder nods, his skin folded like dry riverbeds, and glances at the mark on the ground where high water has crept in recent summers. When the meeting ends, the traders open their packs. There are small cones of blue pigment, beads made from shells, and a knife of hammered copper. In return, the villagers offer jars of oil, baskets of grain, and a woven blanket. The exchange is not just goods, it is attention, curiosity, memory shifting to make room for new shapes. Later, the man who writes on clay returns to his slab. He adds a small symbol he uses only for days when strangers arrive. It is a bend in a line, the curve a river might make if it had a choice. By evening, the settlement becomes soft again. Lamps blink to life, one by one, like cautious stars. The first note of a flute floats from a doorway. The river answers with its own steady hush. When darkness deepens, a figure climbs the small slope beyond the outermost house and looks up. He is a farmer who measures the sky with a knotted cord, counting nights between the thin, new moon and the round one. He will tell the elders how much time remains before the river begins to rise. The quiet spreads through the houses. Those who cannot sleep listen to the small sounds that make a settlement a home. Before dawn, a wind comes over the hills, thin and clean. It combs the tamarisk and ripples the river skin. Daylight returns with its pale, patient hand and touches the edges of everything. Men walk to the place where the hill offers stone. They test the rock with mallets, lift, then rest. The rhythm of their work becomes a kind of breath. Women carry baskets of wet clay and sand to mix with straw. Hands press it into molds and set it to dry. Each brick receives a thumbprint. The man with the stylus inscribes a new tablet. He writes the names of those who hauled stone, mixed clay, lifted and placed. By afternoon, the first corner of the wall stands 3 men high. Children squint to see the top. Elders test the base and nod. The river moves past, unconcerned. In the shade of a fig tree, the youngest elder and the woman, who goes to the well at dawn, plan a schedule for drawing and storing water. When evening comes again, the river holds the sunlight like a memory. The first stars appear. The farmer with the knotted cord measures again. The settlement breathes as one body. Night folds itself around the houses and the river and the unfinished wall. The air feels warmer now, yet it carries a faint trace of the cool night that has only recently faded. In the far distance, a faint shimmer of heat dances above the dunes, making the horizon waver as if it were breathing. A heron glides low over the river, its wings catching the last threads of gold in the afternoon light. Somewhere, a child laughs quietly while chasing a stray chicken between the houses, the sound blending softly into the calm rhythm of the village. The traders rest under the shade, speaking in low voices, their words heavy with the weight of distant places. The wall, though still in its infancy, already feels like a promise to those who pass it on their way to the river. Morning breaks with a pale light that filters through the woven reed roofs, scattering soft patterns across the earthen floors. The air is fresh, carrying the scent of damp soil and the faint sweetness of crushed herbs from the evening before. Roosters call lazily, not in a rush to announce the day. The river lies calm, its surface still dark from the night, holding the reflection of the fading stars. Men gather near the growing wall, speaking in low tones. Their hands are rough, but they carry the weight of stone with practiced care. as if lifting not only rock, but the future of the settlement. The wall is still short enough that a child could climb it, yet in the minds of the elders, it already stands taller than memory. It is not just protection from water they build. It is a sign of a community willing to endure together. The potter, whose hands usually shape clay, now shapes the mud mortar between stones. He works slowly, pressing the mixture into gaps, smoothing each joint with the palm of his hand. Every stone fits against another like a thought placed carefully in a story. In the shade nearby, a group of women knead clay mixed with straw, shaping bricks that will dry in the sun before joining the wall's next layer. The sound of straw rustling and wet clay is soft and steady, like a whisper repeated endlessly. The traders who arrived the day before walk the perimeter, studying the work. One of them, older than the rest, points at the base of the wall and suggests a deeper foundation at certain bends. His voice carries no demand, only the weight of experience. The elders listen, their faces thoughtful, then nod in agreement. They have learned that wisdom is not always born within the walls of one's own home. By mid-morning, the first section reaches the height of a man's chest. Children watch from a distance, their eyes following the rhythm of stone and clay, stone and clay. They carry water to the workers, filling clay cups from jars kept cool beneath woven covers. The water smells faintly of the river, clean and familiar. Workers pause to drink, tilting their heads back and letting the coolness run down their throats before returning to the wall. At the edge of the settlement, a group of young men prepare to leave for the hills. They carry baskets and tools, heading to gather more stone. The path they follow winds through sparse shrubs, the earth dry and uneven beneath their feet. As they walk, they speak of things beyond the work, of a festival upriver they have only heard of the taste of honey from hives kept far from here, of the shape of stars when viewed from higher ground. Meanwhile, the scribe sits in the shade, clay tablet before him. He records each step of the building, how many stones laid, how many bricks formed, how many jars of water used. His marks are deliberate, each one pressed deep enough to last beyond his lifetime. He knows that someday, these marks may be the only voice left to speak of this day. By noon, the sun stands high and the air grows heavier. Shadows shrink to thin lines. The workers rest beneath timorous trees, eating flatbread and dates. The traders share dried figs and speak of the road ahead, pointing to places on the leather map where rivers branch like the veins of a leaf. The elders listen closely, committing each fork and crossing to memory. In the afternoon, work resumes with a slower rhythm, the heat pressing down on shoulders and backs. The sound of mallets on stone echoes across the settlement, mingling with the soft hiss of wind through reeds. Birds circle above, their shadows drifting lazily across the ground. By late day, the second section of the wall begins to rise. The setting sun paints the stones in warm gold, making them seem older than they are, as if they have always stood there. The river reflects this light, sending trembling lines across the underside of the reed roofs. In the evening, the settlement settles into quiet again. The baker removes the last round of bread from the oven, its crust crackling softly. The potter washes his hands in a basin, the clay swirling into the water like fading smoke. Children chase each other in the dust, their laughter carrying lightly in the cooling air. The farmer with the knotted cord stands at his usual place on the slope, measuring the distance between a rising star and the horizon. His count is precise, and when he lowers the cord, he knows exactly when the moon will vanish and when the river will begin to swell. He will speak of it in the morning, and plans will shift accordingly. Night comes with a slow exhale. Lamps glow in doorways. The river's voice deepens, steady and low. Somewhere, a flute plays a few gentle notes before falling silent. Inside the houses, people lie down, listening to the quiet that settles over walls both new and old. The air carries the scent of fresh mortar and baked bread, a mingling of work and sustenance. Above, the stars shine without hurry, their light crossing distances greater than any road the traders have traveled. The wall stands in shadow now, cool and solid, holding the day's effort in its lines. In sleep, the settlement dreams not of danger or hardship, but of a tomorrow where the wall stands taller, the river runs steady, and the people within its reach wake to the sound of another day beginning. The first light of dawn touched the unfinished wall, turning its edges silver against the still dark earth. A cool mist rose from the river, drifting low over the reeds and curling into the open spaces of the settlement. The morning air felt clean, as if the night had rinsed away every sound and scent, leaving only the soft rustle of water. Women were the first to move through the quiet, carrying empty jugs to the well. Their steps were light, their voices low, speaking only in murmurs so as not to disturb the houses where sleep still lingered. A small boy followed, yawning wide enough to make his eyes water. He rubbed them with the back of his hand and looked toward the wall, now catching the first warmth of the sun. The elders gathered under the tamarisk near the riverbank. The farmer with the knotted cord spoke of the moon's slow thinning, of the signs in the water's behavior. He pointed to a faint line along the bank where the earth was darker, a mark left by the river's reach during the last swell. His voice was calm, but the meaning was clear. The river would soon begin to rise again. Men and women returned to the wall with renewed focus. The foundation had held firm overnight, its stones unmoved despite the slight tremor of wind and water in the dark hours. They began placing the next course of bricks, pressing each into the layer below, tapping gently to settle them. The sound was steady and almost rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat. By mid-morning, the settlement stirred fully. The baker lit his fire, sending up a thin column of smoke. The smell of warming bread drifted outward, curling around the workers and giving them reason to pause briefly in appreciation. Across the way, a group of young girls sorted bundles of reeds, stripping the softer fibers for weaving into mats. The sound of reed fibers snapping joined the low hum of voices and the occasional splash from the river. Near the water, fishermen prepared their nets. They checked each knot carefully, tightening where needed, their fingers moving with a precision born of long practice. Two of the traders stood watching, one asking questions about the river's fish, the other making quiet notes on a strip of leather. They spoke of how the patterns of fish change with the season, how some could be caught only in the weeks before the floods. The sun climbed higher, and the air began to shimmer faintly over the packed earth paths. Workers sought shade in turns, resting under the wall's growing shadow. The wall itself now stretched in a slow curve, following the bend of the river, each section tied to the next as though it had grown there naturally. Its base was wider than the top, giving it strength against the weight of water yet to come. The scribe worked in the shelter of a low awning, marking the progress on a fresh clay tablet. His stylus tapped gently, each sign pressed into the damp surface with care. He recorded the number of bricks laid that day, the names of those who labored, and the materials brought from the hills. His tablet would dry in the afternoon sun, to be stored alongside others in a small covered alcove near the elders' meeting place. In the afternoon, clouds drifted over from the west, bringing a faint smell of rain. The elders took this as a sign to quicken the pace. Voices grew more focused, hands moved faster. Stones were lifted, mortar pressed, gaps filled with smooth precision. A breeze stirred the reeds, carrying the scent of the approaching weather into every corner of the settlement. When the first drops began to fall, they were light and few, tapping softly on the roofs and the half-finished wall. No one stopped. The workers pressed on, knowing the rain was brief and would pass quickly. And it did, leaving behind a darker shade on the clay, the color of earth refreshed. By evening, the day's work was done. The wall stood taller now, casting a longer shadow toward the river. It had begun to take on a presence, a quiet strength that could be felt even by those who did not touch it. The river flowed past, steady and patient, as if acknowledging the work, but not yet ready to test it. Families gathered near their homes, sharing bread, dates, and dried figs. Children played at building their own tiny walls from stones, mimicking the day's labor with laughter and shouts. The elders watched, their expressions soft. They knew the day would come when the children's games would become the work of their own hands. Night returned slowly. The sky deepened to indigo, and the first stars pierced the dark. The lamps in the houses flickered to life one by one. The sound of the river grew clearer as other noises faded. Inside the houses, people lay down to rest, the warmth of the day still lingering in the air. The wall stood in silence, its new stones cooling in the night, the marks of the workers' hands still fresh on their surfaces. Above, the constellations turned in their ancient paths, the same stars that had watched over countless walls and countless rivers. The settlement breathed evenly, its heart steady, its streams quiet. The river's patience held, and the night was gentle. Morning arrived with a pale gold that moved gently across the unfinished stones. Dew clung to the low grasses near the river, each drop a tiny mirror that held the sky. The wall curved with quiet purpose, its base firm, its new courses drying to the color of warm dust. People stepped lightly, as if not to disturb the patience that seemed to hover over the work. The farmer with the knotted cord met the elders at daybreak. He spoke of the moon that was thinning toward darkness, and of a faint swell in the river that he had marked with a stake at the edge of the bank. His hands moved carefully over the cord, counting knots with a habit older than memory. The elders listened, then set the day's tasks in a few simple lines. More stone from the hill, more clay and straw for brick. A deeper channel to guide overflow where the bank dipped low. Work began with a steady rhythm. Young men and women followed the path toward the hill, a line of figures crossing the pale slope. They sang under their breath to match the lift and set of their steps. At the quarries, they pried loose blocks that had been waiting for centuries. Tools clicked and echoed, and flakes fell in bright arcs that caught the sun. The air carried the scent of stone dust and sage. By mid-morning, the river spoke in a slightly fuller voice. It did not rush. It did not threaten. It simply pressed a little more firmly against its bed, as if shifting to a new position. Fishermen noticed first. They felt the light pull on their nets change, felt the river tug with a new patience that meant a different depth. They told the scribe, who nodded and added a small mark to his tablet, a single bent line that would remind him of today's first sign. Near the wall, children brought water and shade mats. The baker sent a basket of warm rounds and a jar of date paste that gleamed like amber. Workers ate in brief pauses, hands resting on knees, eyes still following plumb lines and joints. The older trader, the one who had suggested the leaning angle of the wall, stood back and watched without a word. There was satisfaction in his gaze, not pride exactly, but the quiet relief of a plan that holds. The youngest elder visited the well and then the storage jars. She traced her finger along the cool clay and listened to the hollow tone of water levels. She asked the woman who drew water at dawn to measure carefully and to cover each jar with woven reed caps that could keep the air from quickening the loss. She was not afraid. She was exact. In the afternoon, clouds gathered again, higher than the day before, thin and bright on their edges. A breeze moved through the reeds and set a soft music along the bank. The scribe recorded the count of stones lifted, the number of bricks set, and the hours between brief rests. He wrote the name of the farmer with a cord and the number of knots that remained before the new moon. He did not hurry. He pressed each mark as if the clay were a slow river that would remember his touch. Children played a quiet game near the shade of the wall, lining small pebbles and curves that echoed the larger work. They named the pebble lines after places they had never seen using words. They had heard from the travelers, the bend with the bluebirds, the ford with the cold stones, the hill that shows the sea on a clear day. Their world expanded by the width of a word and the length of a story. As the sun tilted toward the west, the workers returned from the hill with new stone. Shoulders shone with dust and sweat. The wall accepted each block with a firmness that encouraged the next. The river carried flecks of reflected light, a glitter that looked like speech without sound. A heron stepped through the shallows, lifting each leg with deliberate grace, as if it too measured the day. Toward evening, the elders gathered once more. They spoke of the channel that would lead overflow into a shallow basin where reeds could drink what the river gave. They spoke of binding the bank with baskets of woven roots, pressed into the damp earth before the first strong rise. They agreed to keep a watch in pairs through the night, not because they expected a sudden rush, but because attention itself is a kind of shelter. After the meal, music lifted from a doorway, a flute threading a narrow path through the settlement. The notes wandered and returned like a traveler who knows the way by heart. Lamps glowed. The potter turned a bowl in his hands and admired the thinness of its lip, which pleased him because it meant the clay had listened. The baker banked his coals and whispered a thanks to the day for holding steady. The farmer climbed the slope with his cord and measured the sky. He counted the stretch between the evening star and the line of the world, and he felt the measure match the one in his mind. He closed his eyes and saw the river as a long body turning in sleep. Tomorrow, he thought, the turning would be a little deeper. Night settled with a soft weight. The wall cooled and held its own moonlight. The river kept speaking, a low, level voice that had watched many beginnings. In the houses, people lay down and let the breath of the night pass over their faces. The air smelled of clean water, warm stone, and the faint sweetness of crushed herbs. Somewhere a dog sighed, and a gate mat lifted once and fell still. Before sleep took them, several people thought of the same simple thing. A hand pressed into clay leaves a shape. The day had left many shapes. Some were marks on tablets. Some were stone seated true. Some were decisions that could not be seen, but that had weight all the same. The settlement rested inside those shapes, the way a body rests inside a well-woven blanket, and the night spread out like a calm river that had decided for now to move without haste. The morning began with a veil of pale mist over the river. It drifted low, wrapping the reeds and softening the edges of the opposite bank until both water and land seemed part of the same breath. The unfinished wall stood like a quiet sentinel in this early light, its stones darker with the dew. Beyond it, the air smelled of wet clay and the faint sweetness of fig leaves warming under the first touch of the sun. The elders gathered near the place where the river curved most sharply. Here, the bank sloped gently, and the earth beneath was soft enough to shape. The plan was simple in idea, though patient in work: a shallow basin to catch the river's overflow when the water rose. The basin would feed the reeds and keep the current from striking the wall's base with all its force. Men and women moved together on the task. Some cut the grass and cleared the reeds in a wide arc, their blades whispering through the stalks. Others dug into the bank with wooden spades, loosening the damp earth and lifting it in wicker baskets. Each basket was carried up the slope, where the soil would be dried for brick or used to build low ridges that guided water into the basin. The smell of fresh earth rose around them, rich and cool. By mid-morning, the basin had begun to take shape. Its edges curved like the inside of a clay bowl, smooth where hands and tools had passed again and again. At the lowest point, workers packed the floor with a mix of clay and sand, pressing it down with flat stones until it formed a firm skin. Children carried small handfuls of pebbles, scattering them along the bottom so the water would sound softer when it arrived. The farmer with the knotted cord paused in his usual watch to help pack the clay. He worked silently, but his eyes moved often to the river. The water was steady now, but his measurements told him it would not remain so for long. The scribe sat nearby, tablet balanced on his knee. He marked the width of the basin, the number of hands that worked, the tools borrowed from each household. He added a small drawing of the basin's curve, no more than a few lines, but enough for someone in the future to see the shape as it was on this day. At the wall, other workers continued their own steady labor. Stones were laid, mortar pressed, lines checked against the plumb. The older trader walked the length of the wall, testing joins with his palm, nodding when the stones did not shift. He spoke briefly with two men about setting a heavier base where the curve of the wall met the line of the bank. They listened and set the idea aside for tomorrow's work. In the afternoon, the basin was nearly finished. A narrow channel connected it to the river's edge, lined with reeds whose roots would hold the soil when the water flowed. The youngest elder placed the first reed herself, pressing the root into the damp clay and covering it with her hands. Around her, others did the same until the channel's line was green with life. The breeze shifted and carried the smell of baking bread from the settlement. The workers paused to drink water from cool jars. The baker had sent fresh rounds and a small pot of honey. They ate in the shade, their voices low, the sound mingling with the steady hush of the river. When the sun began its descent, the last of the basin's work was done. Its surface caught the gold of the evening light, glowing as though it already held water. The channel waited, a silent path from river to reeds. The elders stood together at the edge, looking out over their work. They said little, but the set of their shoulders spoke of relief. As the settlement settled into evening, the wall cast a long shadow across the ground. Children played near its base, running their hands over the new stones as if memorizing their feel. The potter, finished with his day's shaping, stood at the wall's corner and studied the joints, thinking about how the clay and stone met and how each would weather the coming water. Night approached with a slow, cooling breath. The first stars shimmered above the river, their reflections trembling on the surface. Lamps glowed in doorways, and the air filled with the mingled scents of cooked grain and fresh earth. The river flowed on, calm for now, carrying the promise of the rise to come. Inside the houses, people lay down, their muscles pleasantly heavy from the day's work. The basin rested in the dark like a waiting vessel. The wall stood in quiet readiness, and the river moved past with the patience of something that has seen many walls, many banks, and many seasons of change. The stars wheeled overhead, silent witnesses to the day's labor. The settlement slept, wrapped in the cool air of night, its breath in time with the slow, eternal motion of the water. The night had been clear from its first hour, the stars steady in their familiar places. The moon was only a thin blade, low to the west, and the river's surface was dark, broken only by small glints from distant lamps. The air was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of baked clay and the sweet smoke of evening fires. Most of the settlement had fallen asleep, the houses quiet except for the occasional shift of a resting body or the low call of a bird from the reeds. It was the youngest elder who saw it first. She had stepped outside to check the lamps along the path to the well. As she turned toward the river, her eyes caught a spark in the sky that was brighter than any star she knew. It shone with a pale silver light, steady and sharp. At first she thought it was one of the usual bright stars, but then she noticed that it was not where it had been the night before. It had moved, and it continued to move, slowly but with a clear purpose, sliding across the dark like a bead on a thread. She called softly to the farmer with a knotted cord, who was still awake, studying the moon's decline. He looked up and stared for a long moment before saying anything. His voice was low when he spoke, as if sound might disturb the thing in the sky. "It is not a wandering star," he said, "for those move over many nights. This is something else." Word spread quietly from doorway to doorway. People stepped into the cool air, wrapping themselves in shawls and blankets, their faces tilted upward. Children clung to their parents' arms, pointing at the silver point that seemed to glide above the horizon. The older trader, who had traveled farther than any of them, frowned and said he had seen a light like this only once, many years ago, when he was still a boy. That one had burned in the sky for several nights and then vanished with the coming of a storm. The scribe brought his clay tablet and, by the dim light of a small lamp, drew the position of the moving star in relation to the familiar constellations. He pressed small marks to show its place now and left room to mark it again in the nights to come. The farmer measured it against the knotted cord, counting the hand's width from the horizon. He noted that it seemed to follow a path just above the line where the hills met the sky. For a time, no one spoke. The light moved slowly, crossing the space between two bright stars before the moon touched the hills. Then it dimmed slightly, as if drifting behind a veil, and finally was gone. People looked at one another, searching faces for certainty, but none could say what they had seen. In the morning, work began as always. The wall rose, the basin held its shape, the channel to the reeds stayed clear. But the talk between workers was different. They spoke of the light in the sky, of whether it would return, of what it might mean. Some believed it was a sign of change, perhaps a good one. Others felt it was a warning. A few simply thought it was a wonder to be remembered. The scribe kept his tablet in a safe place, away from damp air and careless hands. He planned to add each new position of the star if it returned. The farmer checked his cord more often than usual, measuring not only the moon and the stars, but also the empty place where the moving light had been. That evening, people gathered earlier than usual. They stood near the river, eyes searching the darkening sky. The air cooled, the first stars appeared, and the thin moon followed its path. Just as the horizon deepened to black, a murmur passed through the group. There it was again, the silver light, a little higher now, moving with the same slow purpose. It seemed closer than the night before, its glow more steady. The youngest elder felt a quiet stirring in her chest. She wondered if the light would pass over their settlement, if it would see the wall and the river and the people working together. She wondered if it had seen other places before theirs, other walls, other rivers. The light continued its silent crossing until it slipped beyond the bend of the horizon. This time, no one hurried to speak. They simply stood for a while longer, looking at the place where it had been, before turning back to their homes. That night, sleep came more slowly. The sound of the river was the same, the air just as cool, yet something in the sky had shifted the shape of their thoughts. The settlement rested beneath the turning constellations, and above them, somewhere in the dark, the moving star kept to its path. The morning after the second sighting of the moving star was filled with a strange quiet. It was not the stillness of sleep or the slow pace of work, but something more delicate, as if every sound carried a question. The wall rose another layer. The basin held its damp clay shape. The channel to the reeds glistened with dew, yet the work felt different. Hands moved with their usual skill, but eyes drifted often to the sky, even in daylight. At the well, the youngest elder spoke softly with the woman who drew water each dawn. They wondered aloud if the star would come again, and if its return was meant for the settlement alone, or for all who lived along the river. A fisherman passing by paused to say that in his father's time, a strange light had appeared in the sky, and the fish had changed their patterns for weeks. He could not say if the two things were connected, only that people had remembered them together. The scribe sat near the wall's base, his tablet on his knee, drawing the star's path as it had been for 2 nights. The lines were simple, a curve between familiar constellations, but to him they felt like the first marks of a map not yet finished. He planned to keep a record for as long as the star appeared, so that those who came after could trace its journey. By midday, a small group gathered in the shade of the tamarisk to share food and speak of the light. The older trader told of a place far from the river, where a bright star had once guided travelers through a sea of shifting sand. They had followed it for days until they reached water. To some, this meant the moving star was a guide. To others, it was simply a coincidence, a story made large by distance and time. The farmer with the knotted cord measured the sky in the afternoon, though the star would not appear until night. He explained to 2 boys how the cord's knots marked the path of the moon, and how a star's movement could be measured the same way. The boys listened, their eyes on the empty sky, trying to imagine the silver point gliding there. When evening came, the settlement gathered again near the river. The air was cool, carrying the smell of water and distant wood smoke. The thin moon hung low, and the first bright stars appeared. Then, as if keeping a promise, the moving light emerged from the horizon. Its path was the same as before, yet something in its glow seemed deeper, as if it had grown more certain. The people watched in silence. Some thought of it as a messenger, others as a sign from the ancestors, and a few simply admired its steady grace. A young girl asked her mother if the star could see their wall. The mother smiled and said that if it could see the river, then it could see everything the river touched. The star crossed the sky with unhurried precision, sliding between the same 2 bright stars it had passed before. The scribe marked its position on a new tablet. The farmer checked its height against the cord. The older trader nodded to himself, though he said nothing. When the star disappeared beyond the western hills, the people lingered for a while. Some spoke quietly of its beauty. Others wondered if it would remain for many nights or vanish as suddenly as it had come. Eventually, they returned to their homes, lamps glowing warmly against the cool air. That night, the settlement slept under a sky that felt less fixed than before. The river whispered against its banks, the wall held its new stones, and the basin waited in silence. Somewhere above, unseen for the moment, the moving star continued its journey, carrying with it the quiet attention of those who had watched from below. The day after the third sighting of the moving star began with the sound of quiet voices in the elders' meeting place. The air was cool, the sun not yet high enough to warm the stones. The elders sat in a circle, their hands resting on their knees, listening to the farmer with a knotted cord. He spoke calmly, but his words carried weight. The star had moved farther along its path each night, and its course seemed to follow the river's bend. Whether this was chance or design, he could not say, but he believed it would pass above them again for many nights to come. The older trader leaned forward. He told the story of a settlement far upriver that had once marked the arrival of a rare star with a gathering of neighboring villages. They had traded goods, shared food, and set agreements that lasted for seasons. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried the memory of that place. Such a gathering, he said, could bring both strength and knowledge. The youngest elder listened without interrupting. Then she spoke of the basin and the wall, of how both were strong, but would face their true test when the river rose. If neighboring settlements came, they could see what had been built here and might choose to join their own efforts in the same way. She suggested sending word along the river paths, inviting trusted neighbors to visit during the star's passage. The scribe, seated at the edge of the circle, recorded each point on a clay tablet. He noted the star's role in the discussion, the suggestion of a gathering, and the agreement that would follow. For him, these were not just words, but the marks of a turning in the life of the settlement. Outside, work continued. The wall grew another layer, the basin's clay lining dried in the sun, and the channel to the reeds held its shape. Yet the talk among the workers was filled with a new plan. Some wondered what goods the visitors might bring. Others thought of the stories they might hear. Children imagined meeting people who lived beyond the far bend of the river. By midday, runners were chosen to carry the message. They were young and swift, familiar with the paths along the riverbank. Each was given a small token, a bead of copper, a strip of dyed cloth, to show they came with the elders' trust. Their task was simple: travel to each nearby settlement, speak of the moving star, and invite their people to come before the river's highest days. The afternoon was filled with preparation. Spaces were cleared near the meeting place for visitors to rest. The baker began setting aside extra grain for bread. The potter shaped new cups from pale clay. The fishermen repaired their best nets, speaking quietly of the catch they might share. As evening approached, the settlement gathered again near the river. They had seen the star for 3 nights, and now they watched for its 4th. The air cooled, the thin moon hung low, and then the light appeared, steady and silver, rising from the horizon as if it had been waiting for them. People stood in silence, some holding hands, some with arms folded against the chill. The runners, who would leave at first light, watched the star with particular attention. One of them, A young woman with hair bound in a braid whispered that she would follow its path in her mind as she traveled, letting it guide her along the river. The star crossed the sky in its slow, deliberate way, passing between the same two bright points before slipping toward the west. The scribe marked its position again. The farmer measured its height. The elders exchanged glances that held both caution and hope. When the star was gone, the people returned to their homes. Lamps glowed in doorways, the scent of bread drifted from the ovens, and the sound of the river filled the spaces between the houses. Above, beyond their sight, the star moved on, carrying their decision into the wide dark. The morning sun rose over the river in a soft haze, the air carrying the scent of damp reeds and warming clay. The runners had left 3 days earlier, each taking a different path along the water's edge. Now the settlement waited for their return, eyes turning often to the bends in the river and the paths that led away into the hills. Work on the walls slowed slightly, not from neglect, but from the quiet pull of anticipation. The basin was finished, its smooth clay surface ready to receive water, and the channel to the reeds shone in the morning light. The fishermen set their nets early, hoping for a good catch to share when visitors came. The baker prepared larger batches of dough, and the potter worked at his wheel, shaping vessels with simple lines that would dry quickly in the sun. By midday, the first sign of return came. From the east, where the path wound through a grove of date palms, a figure appeared carrying a walking staff and wearing a cloak lightened by dust. It was one of the runners, the young woman with the braid. She moved at a steady pace, her face calm but her eyes bright. Behind her came 2 strangers, each leading a donkey loaded with baskets. The elders went to meet them at the edge of the settlement. The runner bowed her head briefly before speaking. She had gone to a settlement 2 days' travel away, one known for its woven cloth and dyed threads. They had received her warmly and agreed to come during the star's next crossings. These 2 strangers were sent ahead with a gift baskets filled with dried figs, small cones of indigo pigment, and a length of cloth dyed deep blue. The youngest elder accepted the gifts and offered in return jars of oil and fresh bread. The strangers spoke with quiet voices, their words carrying the lilt of another place, yet clear enough for all to understand. They looked often toward the wall, and one of them traced the air as if measuring its height with his hand. In the afternoon, another runner returned from the north. She brought news that 2 riverside settlements had promised to send their elders to meet here. They would bring grain and a kind of smoked fish unknown in this place. Her feet were sore from the journey, but she smiled as she spoke, the satisfaction of a task completed showing in her voice. The scribe recorded each arrival, each promise, and each gift, pressing the marks into fresh clay. The potter set aside the vessels he had been shaping and offered water to the travelers. The baker gave them bread still warm from the oven, and children followed at a distance, curious but shy. As the day cooled, people began to prepare spaces for their guests. Mats were laid under the tamarisk trees, and jars of water were placed nearby. A fire was built in the open, not for cooking yet, but to offer warmth as the evening came. When the sun dipped low, the settlement gathered at the river's edge. They had seen the star for many nights now, but tonight its light would shine on new faces among them. The first stars appeared, the thin moon set early, and then the silver light rose from the horizon, steady and clear. The visitors stood with the others, their eyes fixed on the moving star. One of them spoke softly to his companion, and though the words were not understood by all, the tone was unmistakable wonder and respect. The star crossed the sky in its unhurried way, and the scribe marked its path again, adding a small note that tonight it had been watched by eyes from other lands. When the star was gone, the fire in the open space became the center of the gathering. Stories were shared in low voices, gifts were examined, and the river's whisper filled the pauses between words. Above them, unseen now, the star continued its journey, while below, the settlement began the first evening of what would soon be a meeting of many voices. The days that followed the first arrivals were filled with a quiet, steady rhythm of preparation. Each morning, the sun rose over the river, painting the water with soft light, and each evening, the people waited for the silver star to appear. With each passing night, the number of strangers among them grew. From the south came a group of three, carrying baskets filled with dried apricots and pale nuts from trees that did not grow near this part of the river. Their leader, a tall man with a wide-brimmed hat made from woven reeds, bowed deeply before the elders. He spoke of the journey along the riverbank, where they had camped under palm trees and crossed stretches of stone that held the heat of the day long into the night. His people had heard of the moving star and of the strong wall being built here, and they had come to see both with their own eyes. From the west came a pair of traders, their donkeys loaded with jars of honey sealed with clay. The younger of the two carried a small harp, and in the evenings he would pluck at its strings, filling the air with gentle, unhurried notes. The sound was unfamiliar to the children, who would gather at a distance, swaying slightly without realizing it. The northern path brought a small family, a man, a woman, and a child no older than 5. They had no goods to trade, but carried with them a story. In their settlement, the star had been seen as a sign that the river's waters would be generous this season. They had come to share in the watching, believing that being near others under its light would bring them good fortune. The open space near the tamarisk trees became a living place of exchange. Mats were laid out for rest, jars of water were refilled each morning, and the fire at the center was kept alive from dusk until dawn. The baker worked without pause, shaping loaves in the early hours so they would be ready when the first smoke rose from the fire. Fishermen brought their catch each evening, arranging the silver shapes on woven trays before cleaning them for the night's meal. The scribe, who had once only marked the wall's progress and the star's path, now kept a record of the names, goods, and stories of the visitors. Each mark on the clay felt to him like a small stone added to the settlement's foundation. The farmer with the knotted cord measured the star's position every night, explaining to the curious how it shifted slightly, as if making its way toward a distant place. On the 7th night after the first visitor's arrival, the elders decided it was time to begin the gathering. Word was sent through the settlement, and before the sun had fully set, people and visitors alike were making their way to the riverbank. The air was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of smoke and baking bread. The water reflected the deepening blue of the sky. As the first bright point appeared overhead, a hush fell across the crowd. Then, as though answering that silence, the moving star rose once more from the eastern horizon. It shone with the same steady silver as before, sliding upward with unhurried grace. Eyes turned toward it from every corner of the gathering, elders, children, traders, farmers, and travelers alike. The youngest elder stepped forward. She spoke slowly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by all. She welcomed those who had come, naming their settlements with care. She spoke of the wall that would protect them when the river rose, the basin that would hold the water, and the star whose path had brought them together. Then she invited each group to speak in turn, to share what they had brought and what they hoped for in the seasons ahead. One by one, voices rose. The southern leader offered dried fruit and the promise of reed mats strong enough to withstand the damp. The western traders promised honey for the settlement stores and music for its evenings. The northern family offered no goods but pledged their hands to help in any task. The star climbed higher, its silver light steady above them. The scribe marked this night with care, pressing into the clay the record of the first great gathering under the moving star. The fire at the center burned brighter as the voices mingled, weaving stories, promises, and quiet laughter into the cool air. When the star finally slipped beyond the western hills, the gathering did not end. People lingered by the fire, sharing food and listening to the harp's gentle notes. The river flowed on, carrying the reflection of the sky past the settlement's edge and into the distance. Above them, unseen for now, the star continued its journey, leaving behind the memory of the night it had drawn so many together. Morning returned to the river with a softness that felt earned. The ground still held the faint warmth of last night's fire, and the air carried the mingled scents of honey, baked bread, and damp reeds. People moved without hurry. The gathering had given the settlement a new rhythm, as if the star had reached down and touched the water, setting smooth circles in motion that would widen for many days. Visitors and hosts worked side by side. At the tamarisk shade, baskets were opened and goods laid out in quiet order. A woman from the southern bend set folded reed mats in a neat stack, each edge aligned with the next. Beside her, a man from the west unsealed a jar of honey, letting the golden surface catch the sun for a moment before covering it again. Children went back and forth with cups of water, their steps careful, their eyes bright with the importance of small tasks. The elders began the day with simple agreements. The youngest elder spoke first, suggesting that the basin and channel could be shown to those who wished to build the same in their own places. She proposed that 2 workers from the settlement travel to each nearby village after the flood season, carrying with them knowledge rather than goods. The southern leader nodded, resting a hand on one of the reed mats as if sealing the idea with touch. The western traders asked whether a token could mark such promises. The scribe looked up from his tablet and said that a seal would do. He would carve a small sign into a clay stamp, a curve like the river and a star above it. Those who agreed would press the seal into clay and dry it in their own fires, keeping a record that would not wash away. The first exchange was not of grain or oil, but of tools. A copper knife changed hands for a wooden mallet, and then changed hands again for a coil of dyed thread. There was no rush. People turned each item in their fingers, testing weight, testing balance, measuring the way a thing sat in the palm. The potter showed a visitor from the north how a thin slip could be brushed along a jar's neck to make it stronger. In return, she learned a way to coil clay that saved time without stealing strength. They smiled in the way of those who have understood each other without needing many words. At midday, a small procession went to the wall. The visitors wanted to see it at close range. The older trader walked beside the youngest elder, pointing out where the foundation leaned inward and how the joints met. He praised the places that had been set true and spoke quietly about a corner where weight might settle unevenly after heavy rain. There was no pride in his voice, only a steady wish that the wall would hold. A boy from the south traced a line along the stones with his fingertip and asked why the base was wider than the top. The farmer with a knotted cord crouched and drew a simple shape in the dust, showing how water presses and how a wide foot steadies the body that stands upon it. The boy nodded and drew the same shape beside the first, then drew a star above both. In the open space, the harp sounded again, but now another sound joined it, a soft drum made from stretched skin and a ring of wood. The two voices met and parted like the river around a stone, neither trying to carry the other, each glad to have company. People cooked fish over the coals, a few set pots of grain to boil, and a woman poured a thin stream of oil over torn bread. Laughter rose and faded, and in the quieter moments, the wind carried the reed bed's whisper into the circle of the gathering. In the afternoon, the scribe shaped a larger tablet than usual. He pressed a border of small repeating marks around the edge, then left the center smooth. Onto the surface, he wrote the names of the settlements present the gifts that had passed from hand to hand, and the promises made to warn one another of high water by raising smoke at dawn and dusk, to send runners bearing the river and star seal if help was needed, to share the method of the basin and the angle of the wall, to meet again while the moving stars still crossed the sky, and once more after the flood had gone. He pressed the elders' seals into the damp clay, each impression a quiet thumbprint of authority. When he finished, he held the tablet to the light and looked through it, not because clay lets light pass, but because he liked to pretend that the sky could read what people had agreed to do. Before evening, small lessons passed from fire to fire. A visitor showed how to braid reed fibers into a cord that did not loosen when wet. In exchange, a woman from the settlement taught a knot that could be undone in one tug, even with cold fingers. Two fishermen compared net weights. A child learned to grind pigment from an indigo cone without staining every part of his hands, only the stone and the powder. A man who had never touched a harp before managed to find a simple pattern that pleased him, and then he put the instrument down and smiled as though he had planted a seed. The sky darkened with that unhurried grace which belongs to evenings that know they are welcome. Eyes turned upward even before the first stars came. When the moving light appeared, the soft breath moved through the gathering, not surprise now, but recognition. The star had become a companion. It crossed the sky with the same steady pace, silver and sure. The farmer marked its height with his cord and found it true to his memory. The scribe pressed a tiny dot into a small tablet he kept only for the star, one mark for each night. While the star climbed, the elders completed one more agreement. They decided to name the wall, not because a wall needs a name, but because people do better when they can call a thing they trust by something more than stone. They chose a name that meant river's patience, a phrase that felt right on the tongue and in the chest. The southern leader repeated it and smiled. The western traders said they would carry the name back and speak it along their road. When the star reached the point between the two bright markers that had become everyone's measure, the harp and the drum found a slow, even rhythm, almost like breathing. Conversation softened. The fire settled to a steady glow. Some people closed their eyes and simply listened, their bodies learning a new way to rest among many voices. Later, when the star slipped west and the sky deepened, the gathering did not break all at once. People stood, stretched, and settled again. A mother pulled a blanket over her sleeping child. A visitor added a small stick to the coals, then sat with his hands open to the warmth. The scribe placed the great tablet on a flat stone near the fire so that its surface would dry without cracking. The farmer tied his cord and tucked it under his garment. the way he had done every night for years, and yet with a quiet awareness that the measure he kept was now shared by many. Night held the settlement and the guests with equal care. The river flowed as it always had, but now it carried reflections of more faces and more fires. The wall stood with its new name, the basin waited within its smooth curve, and the channel lay like a calm thought beside the bank. Above, stars kept their places, and the moving lake continued its path, untroubled by the world below, and yet somehow the thread that had drawn those worlds together. Sleep came gently. The harp's last note faded into the reeds. Footsteps quieted. A jar settled with a soft tap. The clay tablet by the fire darkened slightly at the edges as it dried. In the quiet, promises rested beside dreams. When morning arrived, it would find the same river, the same stones, and a settlement no longer alone, its bonds written in clay a might. The morning after the agreements had been set into clay began with a faint mist rising from the river. It drifted low over the water, folding around the reeds and softening the shapes of the far bank. The settlement stirred slowly. Visitors gathered in small groups, speaking in voices that blended with the sound of the current. The scribe checked the tablet that had dried through the night. Its surface had hardened without cracking, and the mark stood sharp under his fingertips. He turned it gently in the light, as though the sky itself might be reading the record. The farmer with the knotted cord joined him, nodding at the seal pressed into the clay. By mid-morning, the mist began to lift, and a young boy who had been playing near the water's edge called out. Something had come down the river, moving slowly, turning in the current. At first, it looked like a simple piece of wood, pale and smooth from time in the water. But as it drifted closer, it became clear that it was a carved plank, marked with shapes that were not the natural lines of grain. The boy waded in up to his knees and pulled it ashore. The surface bore rows of deep cuts, not random, but ordered. The scribe hurried over, kneeling in the damp sand. He traced the grooves with his fingers, tilting the plank so the low sun revealed the pattern. His brow tightened. The marks were not of their own making, but he recognized the style. Far upstream lived a settlement known for carving messages into wood when clay could not be carried. It was a place distant enough that few here had seen it, but traders spoke of it in the cool months. The scribe turned to the elders, explaining that this was a message sent in haste. The lines were rough, the shapes large, meant to be read quickly. As the visitors gathered, the scribe began to read the meaning aloud. The upstream settlement had seen the moving stars well, but they sent warning with their notice. Their river had swollen early, fed by sudden rains and distant hills. They expected the waters to rise much higher than usual, sooner than the season predicted. The message urged all along the river to prepare before the highest days came. The crowd listened in stillness. The youngest elder's gaze turned toward the wall. Her voice was calm, but it carried a new weight. The wall was strong, yet the basin was not yet filled. The channel to the reeds had not yet been tested. If the river came sooner, they would need to finish every task before the star's next crossing. The southern leader stepped forward, offering more reed mats to reinforce storage places for grain. The western traders promised to leave behind extra jars of honey, sealed tight against damp. The northern family, though they had brought no goods, pledged their hands to carry stone and clay until the work was done. The settlement shifted into a new rhythm. The scribe set aside his careful shaping of tablets for quick notes in wet clay that could be fired by nightfall. The potter stopped making cups and began shaping water jugs that could be sealed. The baker baked harder loaves that would keep longer. In the afternoons, the harp still played, but now the rhythm was quicker, as though urging the work along. Children helped by carrying light baskets of clay to the wall builders. Fishermen checked their nets twice a day, smoking the catch so it could be stored. 3 nights after the message arrived, the moving star rose again. This time, people looked upon it with both awe and urgency. It seemed unchanged, moving with its steady pace, yet its light fell now on hands working later into the evening. The farmer measured its height as always, but when he tied his cord, he did so quickly, returning to help at the wall. The elders agreed that when the upstream settlements runners arrived, and they surely would, they would be given space to rest, food to eat, and a voice in the council. Until then, every hour before the river's rise was a gift to be used. The carved plank was placed in the meeting place, resting against the wall where all could see it. It was both a warning and a thread, binding this settlement to another far away, just as the moving star had bound them all to the same sky. The dawn that followed carried a clear, pale light, the kind that makes every shadow sharp along the ground. The air was cool but dry, a reminder that the heat would rise quickly. Work began earlier than usual. The sound of wooden mallets tapping against stone, the low murmur of voices, and the scrape of baskets being set down wove together into a steady rhythm. Not long after the sun had passed its highest point, a call came from the northern path. 2 figures approached at a measured but urgent pace, each carrying a short staff and a small pouch slung across the chest. Dust clung to their legs, and their sandals were worn thin from distance. Their faces were lined, not with age, but with the mark of days spent moving without pause. The first runner was a man with a scar at his temple, his hair bound tightly at the back of his head. The second was a woman with a cloth wrapped around her arm, perhaps to protect an old injury. They entered the open space without ceremony, though the crowd parted in silence to let them through. The youngest elder stepped forward, offering water first, before a single word was spoken. The runners drank slowly, each sip measured. When the man finally spoke, his voice was low and even. He told of rains in the hills, sudden and unseasonable, filling narrow streams that fed the greater river. What had begun as a gentle swell had become a fast-moving rise, and by the time they left their own settlement, the water had already reached the roots of trees that normally stood high above its reach. The woman added that the river sound had changed. It carried a deeper note now, the voice of water pressing against its own banks. The scribe brought out the carved plank found days before, showing it to the runners. They nodded, saying the message had been sent ahead and hope it would arrive before them. They had left at first light 3 mornings past, stopping only to drink and to rest their legs for moments at a time. Around the meeting space, people listened without moving. The southern leader set aside a half-woven mat and asked how many days they thought remained before the high waters reached here. The woman glanced toward the river, then back to the elders. If the current held, perhaps 12 days. If the rains in the hills returned, less. The youngest elder looked at the wall, then at the basin. Her words were calm, but they carried the weight of command. The basin must be cleared of any remaining debris and ready to hold the first rush. The channel must be tested for flow by morning. Storage places for grain and dried fish must be raised on reed platforms high enough to stand above the water's highest memory. The work changed pace again. By late afternoon, teams had formed without the need for orders. The potter joined the builders, her hands shaping mud into sealing layers along the lower stones. The baker and his helpers stored flour in clay jars sealed with wax. The fishermen anchored their drying racks farther inland. The runners rested for only a short while. By evening, they stood again, watching as the basin was tested. Water from the river was guided through the channel, its surface rippling with small eddies where stones lay beneath. The flow was smooth enough, though a few bends needed clearing. Children waded into the shallows to pull away reeds that caught along the edges. The runners nodded with approval, but neither smiled. When night came, the fire in the meeting space burned brighter than usual. The harp played softly, joined by the slow, deep beat of a drum. People gathered not for celebration, but for shared resolve. Above them, the moving star rose, silver and certain, crossing the dark with the same unhurried grace it had shown since it first appeared. Yet tonight, its light fell upon hands and faces that knew time was no longer their own. The scribe made a new tablet, larger than the others. Onto it, he pressed the seals of each group present, visitors and hosts alike. Around the edge, he carved the marks for the number of days until the river's rise. He left space between each, so that one could be cut away each morning as time passed. The runners ate a simple meal of bread, honey, and dried fish. When they had finished, they lay down near the fire, their staves resting beside them. Sleep came quickly, but even in rest, their bodies seemed to hold the shape of motion, as if ready to rise and move again at the sound of water's changing voice. The settlement slept more lightly than before. A few kept watch along the riverbank, listening to the slow pull of the current. In the distance, a night bird called once, then again. Somewhere in the reeds, a small animal moved, the sound just enough to remind those listening that the river held many lives. Above, the moving star continued its path. Below, a basin waited to be tested again at dawn. 12 days, perhaps less. The current whispered its own measure of time, and the settlement, bound now to its warning, prepared to meet it. The night after the runner's arrival was cooler than those before. A faint wind moved down from the hills, carrying the scent of wet earth, though no rain had touched the settlement itself. The fires burned low, and most lay wrapped in blankets, breathing slow in the calm that comes when the day's work has ended. Yet not everyone slept. Near the edge of the river, the farmer with the knotted cord sat on a flat stone, his eyes following the silver arc of the moving star. He had measured it every night since its first appearance, always finding it in the same place against the dark's familiar patterns. Tonight, something in its rise made him pause. He unwound the cord slowly, holding one end at his knee, the other drawn up toward the sky. The star's light fell upon the stretched line, and in that pale glow, he saw the smallest difference, barely the width of a finger. The star was climbing slightly higher than before. It was not enough for most eyes to see, but for one who had watched each night with care, it was certain. The farmer rose quietly and walked toward the meeting space, where the scribe sat with a small fire, shaping a tablet for the morning's plans. Without a word, the farmer placed the cord before him. The scribe understood at once. He stood, stretching the cord himself, checking the knot against the horizon's shape. His brow tightened. A change so small could mean many things, none of them yet known. The youngest elder was called from her rest. She listened without interrupting, her gaze fixed on the fire's embers. When the farmer had finished, she spoke softly. The star had been a guide and a sign of unity, but if it was moving differently, Perhaps it was also a measure of time's own shifting pace. She suggested that they mark its path twice each night now, once as it rose, and again when it stood at its highest point. The three of them, farmer, scribe, and elder, stood by the river until the star reached its peak. The cord confirmed what the farmer had sensed. The star's height had grown. Whether it was the sky that had changed, or the earth that carried them shifting in its own way, none could say. The scribe began a second tablet, smaller but marked with 2 lines for each night, one for the rise, one for the peak. He pressed a tiny star into the clay beside the highest mark, as if to remind himself of the question now carried in its light. Far from the quiet of their watch, the river moved on, untroubled. The current brushed against the reeds, carrying small fragments of leaves and twigs. Somewhere upstream, rain might be falling even now, feeding the water's slow climb. By dawn, the rest of the settlement stirred to the day's work without knowing of the night as discovery. The basin was cleared again, the channel checked for snags. Grain stores were lifted higher on their platforms. Fishermen moved their drying racks another measure inland. It was only in the evening, when the star returned to the sky, that the farmer gathered a small group by the river's edge. He showed them the cord, stretching it against the horizon, then pointing to the mark from nights past. The difference was plain to see now, even to those without his practiced eye. A quiet murmur moved among them, not fear, but the kind of unease that comes when something trusted behaves in an unexpected way. The youngest elder addressed them calmly. The star's shift did not change the work before them. The river still rose, the wall still stood, the basin and channel still waited for the water's first test. But it did mean they should watch more closely, for the world might be telling them more than one story at a time. That night, as the harp played, its strings tuned a little lower to match the drum's slow beat, people found themselves glancing upward more often. The star shone with the same steady light, but to those who had been told, it seemed now to carry a quiet question its path. The runners, hearing of the change, shared that in their own hells. Elders sometimes spoke of wandering lights that foretold seasons of great change floods, dry years, or the arrival of long-awaited visitors. Whether this was one of those signs, they could not say, but they agreed it was worth remembering. Before sleep, the scribe placed the 2 new tablets side by side, one for the river's days, one for the star's nights. He set them near the fire so that their surfaces caught its glow, as if the clay could draw meaning from the warmth. In the darkness, the river and the sky both kept their courses. The water flowed, carrying its unseen burden from the hills. The star crossed above, a little higher now, its light falling on stone, clay, and the faces of those who would meet the morning ready for whatever the world's shifting patterns would bring. The morning came with the stillness that felt heavier than usual. The air was cool, but beneath it lay the faint warmth of the sun waiting to rise higher. People moved through the settlement quietly, carrying baskets, sealing jars, checking the lines of the wall. Every task had been done before, yet each hand seemed to work with a little more purpose now, as though the days themselves were shorter. By mid-morning, a faint haze appeared along the northern horizon. It was not the light gray of mist over the river, but a darker veil shifting slowly. The farmers paused in their work, squinting toward it. Even from this distance, the shape of the haze told them it was not dust. The air between here and the hills carried something heavier, something that blurred the sky. The runners, who had been helping to lift the last of the grain stores onto higher platforms, stopped and stared. They exchanged a glance, then nodded without speaking. They had seen this before. It was the far edge of rain moving down from the high places. By midday, the sound came. At first, it was only the faintest murmur, almost like the hum of insects on a hot day. But as the hours passed, it deepened into a steady rolling tone, distant yet constant. Those who stood on the riverbank swore they could feel it in their feet, a quiet vibration beneath the packed earth. The youngest elder walked the length of the wall, speaking to each group as she went. Her words were calm but clear. The basin must be ready to take water at a moment's notice, the channel kept free from every branch and reed. If the rains reached the hills in full, the river could rise in less than a week. Children, sensing the shift in the air, kept closer to the fire in the meeting space. The harp played softly, the notes carrying a weight that seemed to settle into the air around it. Even the traders, who usually spoke in warm voices about their goods, now moved quietly, storing their wares in places chosen for height and safety rather than display. As the day lengthened, the northern haze thickened. The runners pointed to where the sky met the hills, showing how the line had blurred into a softer, darker band. They spoke of streams that would be rushing already, cutting new channels into the slopes, feeding the great river with every passing hour. By evening, the first change came to the river itself. It was not yet higher, but its surface carried more fragments, twigs, pale leaves, bits of reed drawn down from far upstream. The current moved with a swifter hand, its song just slightly different, the deep tone of its voice now more certain. The farmer with the knotted cord still measured the moving star as it rose. Its height matched the slight change noted nights before, the new arc steady now. Yet tonight, as he tied his knot and handed the cord to the scribe, both men glanced toward the northern haze. The star's light seemed to fall in two worlds at once, on the quiet of their own sky and on the restless darkness gathering far away. After the evening meal, people lingered less than usual by the fire. There was work to finish before sleep. The southern leader oversaw the weaving of new reed mats to cover grain stores. The potter sealed the last of the water jars with clay and ash. The fishermen secured their boats farther up the bank, tying them to thick stakes driven deep into the ground. Later, when most had gone to rest, the runners remained by the river. They listened to the low sound of the distant rain and to the faster rhythm of the current. One of them bent down, dipped a hand into the water, and let it fall back in thin streams through his fingers. The river was still cool, still calm enough to touch without fear, but its surface seemed to carry the memory of something larger approaching. The youngest elder stood with them for a while. She spoke softly, more to the river than to the runners, telling it that they were ready, that the wall would hold, that the basin would welcome its first rush. Whether the river heard or cared, none could know, but the words seemed to settle the watchers, if only for a moment. When the moving star reached its highest point, the scribe made 2 marks on the smaller tablet, one for the star, one for the rain. He had never done this before, but tonight it seemed right. For the first time, the sky's story and the river's story were written together, bound in the same piece of clay. In the hours before dawn, the sound of the rain's distant fall did not fade. It lay in the background of every dream, a steady reminder that the world beyond the settlement was changing. The river flowed on, patient yet certain, carrying toward them the first hidden weight of the storm. Morning opened with a pale light that turned the edges of every stone to silver. The northern band of haze had thickened during the night, and now it held steady like a distant shore seen through glass. The air above the river felt cooler than the earth, and when people exhaled, The breath moved in small white threads that vanished almost at once. The runners stood at the waterline before the sun had cleared the hills. They checked the stakes that held the boats and the rope lines that linked them to the higher posts. One runner pressed his palm to the river skin and lifted it again, watching the wet shine fade from his hand. The current was faster. No one said the word flood. They did not need to. The youngest elder walked the length of the basin and the channel. She tested the clay floor with the heel of her hand and left a clean print that filled slowly with water from the thin seepage of the bank. The print reassured her. The basin would hold. She nodded to the workers, who had gathered reed bundles to line the edges where small eddies might try to bite. By mid-morning, the river had risen the height of a hand. It was not sudden. It was the patient work of distance and hours. Twigs turned in lazy spirals along the near bank. A long strip of bark slid past like a dark fish. Children who had been allowed to watch from the higher ground counted the pieces aloud until they grew bored and turned to the easier work of carrying dry wood to the cooking pits. The scribe fetched the tablet marked for days remaining and cut away the first notch. He set the small curl of clay beside the firestone, as if even that thin piece had meaning that should not be lost. Then he took up a new tablet and recorded the measure at dawn, the feel of the current, the drift of debris, and the sound that had reached the settlement from the north all through the night. He pressed a tiny wave line beside the date and felt a private steadiness return to his chest. At noon, the first test began. A line of people spaced themselves along the channel. At the river mouth, two men lifted a gate of woven reeds and set it on the bank. Water entered with a low sound like breath. It traveled along the curve, darkening the clay as it went, and then slid into the basin with a soft, even pour. There was a brief murmur and then silence, as if everyone had agreed to listen together. The basin took the water, held it, and did not leak. A heron dropped from the air and stood at the rim, as if giving its approval before folding one leg and going still. The older trader knelt near a bend and watched how the surface moved around a shallow ridge of clay. He suggested shaving the ridge by the width of a thumb to prevent a small standing swirl that might grow when the water came harder. The potter, who had sealed jars through the night, stepped into the channel with a flat board and made the correction in 3 passes. When she stepped out, the swirl had vanished, and the line of flow was clean. Clouds from the north advanced by slow degrees. They did not show sharp edges. They arrived more like a mood than a wall. A faint smell of rain reached the settlement and stayed. The fishermen shifted the drying racks again, and a boy counted the paces from the river edge to the first rack, then wrote the number on a shard of old pottery with a bit of charcoal. He would count again at dusk. By late afternoon, the river had risen another hand. The boats tugged at their lines with a restive patience. The youngest elder asked for the lower footpath to be marked with stakes at every 20 paces, so that anyone moving along the bank after dark would feel the path narrowing underfoot before the water covered it. The runners set the stakes and tied a cord between them, so that the line would brush the leg of a walker and warn without surprise. Evening brought the moving star to a sky that felt closer than before. The farmer measured as he always did, and the scribe marked 2 points, one for the rise and one for the peak to come. The star appeared slightly pale behind a high veil, but its path held true. People watched it with quiet faces, not for marvel alone now, but as if taking strength from a promise that something still moved by a known rule. After the meal, a second test began. The elders ordered a controlled surge. At the river mouth of the channel, men lifted a heavier gate and lowered it again in measured beats. Water entered the basin in pulses, like steps taken by a careful giant. The new reed lining held. The clay did not shear. A thin overflow trickled into the reed bed beyond, and the roots drank it with a small sound like rain on skin. Night settled without wind. The sound from the north was deeper now, not louder, but deeper, as if the earth itself had changed the chamber of its chest. The settlement arranged watches in pairs. Each pair held a lamp shielded by a clay ring so that the flame could not be seen by far eyes on the river. They walked the wall and the bank and the paths to the storage platforms. When they met, they traded a soft word and kept moving. Near midnight, the first branch, large enough to carry a knot of reeds, struck the outer stones of the wall and turned away. The impact was not hard, but it left a shine of wet bark on the stone. The scribe noted the time. The potter touched the mark with 2 fingers as if blessing it. Before dawn, the farmer untied his cord once more. He measured the faint stand of the star as it slid toward the western dark. The height was the same as last night. The change had stopped for now, or the new path had settled. He felt a small ease and let air leave his lungs in a long, slow line. When the first bridge began, the river had climbed half the height of a knee. The basin held a wide, calm sheet that reflected a thin gray sky. The channel walls were smooth where the potter had passed her board, and the reed bed beyond smelled alive and green. The settlement woke into a day that would ask for steadiness and receive it. The day began with a low copper glow that reached across the horizon long before the sun itself appeared. The haze that had hovered for days now shifted in color, from a cool gray to something warmer, almost metallic, as though the air itself had taken on the light of hidden embers. The river's surface reflected this strange tint, turning every ripple into a moving ribbon of bronze. By the time the first work teams gathered along the basin, the water had climbed nearly to the height of a man's hip. The clay walls held, but the strain was visible in the thin lines of seepage that darkened certain patches. The potter inspected these with narrowed eyes, pressing her palm against them to feel the temperature of the clay. Warm seepage meant weakness. She marked 3 places with reed stalks, a quiet signal for repair crews. The youngest elder walked slowly along the embankment, her staff tapping the ground in a measured rhythm. She paused at each mistake, speaking softly to the workers, reminding them that every hour mattered now. Her words carried not fear, but the kind of gravity that kept hands steady even under the weight of worry. Above them, the moving star had grown sharper, its path cutting an unmistakable line through the early light. It no longer appeared as a pale wanderer behind a veil. It blazed in full view, a small yet insistent fire. Some whispered that it was an omen, others that it was a guide. The scribe recorded its position on a fresh tablet, adding not only its height, but the faint halo that now surrounded it, like frost around the edge of an unblinking eye. By midday, the northern clouds gathered into a single massive front, darker than any the settlement had seen in recent memory. They did not hurry. Instead, they advanced with the deliberate pace of something inevitable. The smell of rain was thick now, mingled with the sharp scent of wet stone. Fishermen drew their nets far inland, anchoring them between poles driven deep into the ground. The elders called for a gathering in the central square. The sound of the signal horn cut through the air, low and steady. People arrived in small groups, their faces shaded by the weight of unspoken thoughts. The circle formed without command. They knew the order of such meetings. At the center, the oldest elder spoke. His voice, though thin, carried to the edges of the crowd. He told them of the river's rise, of the test that had held but could not hold forever. He told them of the star's unwavering march, its alignment with the highest ridge to the west, and how such a sight had not been seen in generations. Then he spoke of choice, to stay and hold the wall, or to begin the long move to higher ground. Neither path promised safety, only the chance of it. Silence followed, deep enough to hear the slow slap of water against stone. Finally, a woman from the far bank spoke. She said the land above the old quarry could shelter them, that the rock there was dry and strong. Others murmured in agreement, but the farmers reminded them that moving meant abandoning the basin, the channel, and the stores they had worked seasons to fill. The decision was left open until the next morning. In the meantime, the work would continue. If they stayed, they would need every moment. If they left, they would still need the wall to hold long enough for the move. As the meeting broke, the scribe lingered in the square, his eyes fixed on the moving star. He imagined it drawing an invisible thread across the sky, a thread that, if followed, might lead to understanding or to nothing at all. The thought unsettled him, yet he could not look away. That evening, a hush fell over the settlement. No songs rose from the cooking fires, no laughter from the children's games. The only sounds were the measured footfalls of the night watch and the restless shifting of boats in their moorings. Even the herons seemed reluctant to break the quiet, standing motionless in the shallows like carved figures. Near midnight, the first wind arrived. It did not roar or gust. It moved like a slow tide of air, bending the tall reeds in a single direction. With it came a distant sound, not thunder exactly, but something heavier, as if the clouds themselves were breathing in before a great release. In the flickering light of a shielded lamp, the youngest elder looked to the north and whispered to herself, though no one stood close enough to hear, "It begins." The first light of day never truly arrived. Instead, the sky held a dim bruised color, as though dawn had been caught and smothered before it could rise. The air was heavy, pressing down with a weight that made every breath feel thick. From the north came the steady roll of the approaching storm, a sound that was neither nor far, but constant, like the drumbeat of an unseen procession. The river had climbed higher during the night. Its edge now lapped at the base of the lowest stake markers, swallowing the distance that once gave the people comfort. The channel flowed dark and fast, its surface broken by swirling ridges that caught and spun driftwood like toys. Along the basin wall, workers moved quickly, reinforcing the weak spots marked the day before. The potter carried her flat board from one section to the next, pressing fresh clay into every seam until her hands were streaked and raw. Above, the moving star still shone, though its light was pale in the shadow of the storm. It pierced the veil of clouds, just enough to be seen, a single unwavering point in a sky that churned with slow violence. The scribe recorded its position one last time before slipping the tablet into a sealed jar. If the wall failed, he wanted the record to endure. By mid-morning, the wind had strengthened. It came in long, steady pulls, bending the tall reeds and driving ripples against the current. The smell of rain was now almost bitter. From the ridge to the west, a watchman shouted that the far horizon was no longer visible. The storm front had closed the gap entirely. The elders met again in the square, this time without ceremony. Their voices were low but urgent. The choice that had hung in the air since the previous day could no longer wait. The youngest elder spoke first. She urged them to move the people to the old quarry at once, to carry what they could and abandon the rest. The oldest elder hesitated, looking toward the basin. His eyes carried the weight of seasons spent building it, the labor of hands long gone. But when the wind tore a piece of thatch from a nearby roof and sent it tumbling across the square, he nodded. The decision spread quickly, passed from mouth to mouth. Families began to gather bundles, pulling from storage whatever could be carried. Children were told to stay close to the older ones. The runners prepared to lead the first group along the higher ridge path, their eyes scanning the ground for hazards in the growing dimness. As the first groups began to leave, the rain arrived. It fell not in a rush, but in wide, heavy drops that struck the clay with a sound like small stones. Each drop raised a puff of dust before sinking in, darkening the earth. The smell of it mixed with the scent of wet reeds, a smell both clean and foreboding. The river responded almost at once. The current deepened its pull, dragging debris from the far bank and slamming it against the outer wall. Twice, the impact knocked loose stones into the water, where they vanished without trace. Workers scrambled to fill the gaps, but the water pressed harder with each passing minute. In the midst of the work, a child's voice cried out. One of the smaller boats had broken free, spinning slowly in the widening current. Two men waded in after it, but the force of the river drove them back. The boat drifted away, a pale shape swallowed by the bend. No one spoke of it, but the sight hardened the urgency in their movements. By late afternoon, the storm was fully upon them. Rain sheeted across the settlement, blurring the shapes of people and structures alike. The wind carried a low howl now, winding through the reeds and the narrow paths like a voice. The star was gone from sight, hidden behind the roiling mass above, yet its absence was felt as keenly as its presence had been. The last of the families began the climb toward the quarry, their silhouettes small against the dark slope. At the base of the hill, the oldest elder paused and looked back once more at the basin. Through the rain, it appeared both fragile and defiant, holding its shape against the swelling force within. He turned away only when a runner touched his arm and urged him on. As night fell, the storm showed no sign of breaking. The settlement below was now little more than a shadow in the rain. From the high ground, those who had made the climb could see the faint line of the river, a silver thread twisting through the black. It gleamed not with moonlight, but with the reflection of lightning hidden within the clouds. The people huddled beneath makeshift shelters, their clothes heavy with water, their faces turned toward the sound of the river. They listened for the moment when it might change, the moment when the steady roar might become the sound of release. And far beyond the ridge, unseen in the night, the moving star continued its path, waiting for the moment when the clouds would part and reveal it once more. The night stretched long, measured not by hours, but by the rhythm of the storm. Rain hammered the earth in relentless waves, pooling in hollows and running in narrow streams down the slope toward the settlement below. Lightning flared behind the clouds, lighting them from within like paper lanterns carried through dark corridors. The sound of the river had deepened to a roar, a voice too broad to be silenced by distance. From the shelter of the quarry, the people kept their eyes fixed on the lower ground. The shapes of the basin and the walls were ghosts in the rain, half seen, half imagined. Every so often, a faint cracking sound reached them, followed by a muffled splash. No one asked which part of the wall had given way. They simply waited. Near midnight, the storm reached its peak. The wind pushed hard against the shelters, bending poles and tearing at the reed mats. The youngest elder moved among the families, pressing a steady hand to shoulders, speaking softly to calm the restless children. The oldest elder sat at the quarry's edge, the rain streaming from his hood, watching as the basin below began to merge with the swollen river, the lines between them lost. And then, as if the storm had spent its voice all at once, the rain began to thin. The roar of the wind faded to a long sigh. The clouds above loosened their grip, breaking into torn patches that drifted apart. A single breath of cool, clean air passed over the ridge. In that moment, a moving star returned. It shone through a gap in the clouds, brighter than it had in all the nights before. The light touched the wet stone of the quarry, turning each drop of water into a spark. It touched the river below, laying a silver path across the restless surface. Even those who had doubted its meaning found themselves unable to look away. The scribe rose and walked to the edge beside the oldest elder. Without speaking, he held out a tablet wrapped in oiled cloth. The elder took it, turning it over in his hands, knowing it carried the record of their days, of the rise of the river, the building of the basin, the coming of the storm. It was, in its way, the story of their endurance. By dawn, the sky was a pale wash of blue and gold. Mist clung to the lower ground, hiding the worst of the damage, softening the shapes of what had been lost. From above, it was impossible to tell where the river ended and the basin began. The people did not hurry to return. Instead, they stood together at the ridge, their faces turned toward the sun now climbing behind them. The youngest elder spoke at last. She said that the basin had served its purpose, that the river had been met with all the strength they could give. What remained now was to build again, here on the higher ground, with the memory of the old place carried forward like the clay tablets they had saved. One by one, the people began to move into the open space of the quarry, choosing spots for shelters, marking lines in the dirt for paths and hearths. The sound of tools replaced the sound of rain. Voices began to rise again, first in quiet exchanges, then in short bursts of laughter as hands found familiar work. By the time the sun stood high, the moving star was fading into the daylight. It would return at nightfall, as it always had, its path unchanged, steady over a land that was learning once more how to endure.